I never thought that helping a homeless man would be the exact moment my entire understanding of my family would start falling apart, because it began in the most ordinary possible way when Ethan, my boyfriend, noticed a man sitting alone near a small diner and decided to give him food without any expectations, without any idea that this small interaction would eventually turn into something we would not be able to mentally escape once the truth started unfolding. At first, it looked completely unimportant, just a quiet moment of basic kindness in passing, the kind of thing you forget about within minutes. But everything changed the second Ethan showed him my photo, because the man's reaction was not slow or uncertain. It was immediate and deeply unsettling, like he had been hit by something he had spent years trying not to think about. And instead of asking who I was or where the photo came from, he simply stared at it in silence before saying my name, with absolute confidence, as if there had never been any doubt in his mind. And what made the situation feel even more unreal was not just that he recognized me, but the way he said it, because it did not sound like guessing or coincidence or even confusion. It sounded like recognition that came from somewhere personal and buried, and before either of us could even process what was happening, he said something that completely shifted the direction of that moment, telling Ethan that he was my father in a way that was direct, calm, and completely free of hesitation. That sentence alone should not have made sense in my reality, because everything I had ever been told growing up painted a completely different picture, where my father had disappeared from my life when I was too young to remember him properly, leaving behind a version of events that had always been simple, clean, and never questioned. But standing there in front of this man, hearing him speak like he had never actually stopped being part of my life, created the first real crack in that version of truth. When Ethan came back to me after that encounter, I could immediately tell from his expression that this was not something he was going to casually forget or dismiss as a misunderstanding, because he looked unusually serious in a way that made me feel uncomfortable before he even started explaining what had actually happened between him and the man. He told me that the man had not just reacted to my photo, but had studied it in a way that felt personal, as if he was trying to confirm something he already believed to be true. And the most disturbing part was that he didn't hesitate even for a second when he said my name, as if it had been something he had repeated to himself for years, waiting for a moment like this, without knowing if it would ever actually come. I still tried to reject it at first, because the idea was completely incompatible with everything I had been told about my past, but Ethan then showed me the photo he had taken, and in that moment the situation stopped feeling like a strange coincidence, and started feeling like something I could no longer ignore, because it showed my mother standing next to a man I had never seen in my life, both of them looking at each other in a way that did not match the emotional story I had grown up believing. That was the first time I felt a real internal conflict starting, not full belief, not full denial, but something unstable in between, because my memory of my mother had always been tied to a very controlled version of the past, and seeing her in a completely different context created a gap that I could not immediately explain or dismiss. And even though I tried to convince myself that there had to be a simple explanation, the feeling did not go away, because once something like that enters your mind, it stops being just information and starts becoming a question that quietly stays with you no matter what else you are doing. I agreed to meet him because ignoring it was no longer possible, and when Ethan brought me to the shelter where he was staying, I expected confusion, manipulation, or some kind of misunderstanding that would fall apart once confronted directly. But instead I found a man sitting quietly who looked exhausted in a way that felt real rather than performed, as if life had simply worn him down over time rather than a single dramatic event. When I approached him, he looked at me without hesitation, and I saw something in his expression that did not match the idea of a stranger trying to gain attention or sympathy, because it felt like recognition that had been waiting for too long. And when he finally spoke my name again, this time it did not feel like an accusation or a trick, but like something deeply familiar to him. He told me his name was Michael, and instead of giving me a dramatic explanation or trying to convince me immediately, he spoke in a controlled, structured way, explaining that he had once been in a relationship with my mother before everything collapsed due to financial and legal conflict connected to Daniel's company, and that what followed was not abandonment in the way I had always believed, but a gradual removal from my life through legal pressure, custody restrictions, and systematic isolation. The more he spoke, the harder it became to maintain emotional distance, because the details he mentioned were not vague or symbolic, but specific enough to connect to fragments of my childhood that suddenly felt incomplete, like missing pieces of a story I had never been allowed to fully see from the beginning. At some point during that conversation in the shelter, the situation stopped feeling like a strange emotional coincidence and started turning into something I could no longer mentally place into the category of misunderstanding, because the man, Michael, was not only describing my childhood in a way that felt uncomfortably specific, but he also began showing things that could not be easily explained away as imagination or manipulation, and that was the moment when the ground under my certainty finally started to crack in a real and irreversible way. He reached into an old worn bag beside him and pulled out photographs that immediately made my stomach tighten, because they were not random images or vague memories, but clearly personal moments from my early life, taken in situations I had no logical reason to believe he should have ever had access to, and the more I looked at them, the more disturbing it became, not because they were shocking on their own, but because they forced me to confront the possibility that my life had been observed from a distance in ways I had never been aware of. And then came the most difficult moment, because he placed something on the table between us that I initially did not even want to look at closely, a small hospital identification bracelet with my name printed on it, something that carried an undeniable personal connection that no stranger should realistically have been able to keep for years. And seeing it there made it impossible to continue treating the situation as something abstract or emotional, because it suddenly became physical, documented, and disturbingly real. In that moment, I stopped trying to categorize what I was feeling as belief or disbelief, because neither of those responses fully matched what was happening internally, and instead I found myself in a state where two completely incompatible versions of my life were existing at the same time, one I had grown up with and one I was now being forced to consider. And neither of them could simply erase the other without leaving something broken behind. When I asked him why he had kept all of this for so long without trying to contact me earlier in a more direct way, his response was not defensive, but heavy in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than avoidance, because he explained that after legal pressure, financial destruction, and repeated restrictions, every attempt he made to approach the situation had been blocked or reframed in ways that left him with no real path forward without risking even more damage to what little stability he had left at the time. And as I sat there listening, I realized that the most unsettling part was not even what he was saying, but the realization that my understanding of absence had always been too simple, because I had always assumed that someone either chooses to stay or chooses to leave. But what he was describing was something far more gradual and systematic, where a person can be removed from a life step by step until their absence feels natural to everyone except the one who is pushed out. When I finally left the shelter, I did not feel like I had gained clarity, because nothing felt clear yet, but I also could not return to my previous level of certainty, and that in-between state was the first real moment where I understood that whatever was going to happen next would not be about discovering a simple truth, but about dealing with a reality that was already too complex to fit into a single explanation. After I left the shelter, I couldn't go back to my normal life as if nothing had happened, because even the smallest everyday details suddenly felt unstable, like everything around me was still the same on the surface but no longer fully trustworthy underneath, and I knew that the only way forward was to confront the people who had always controlled the version of my past I was allowed to believe. The first conversation was with my mother, and I approached it carefully at first, trying not to accuse her directly, because part of me still wanted a simple explanation that could somehow make everything fit back into place. But the moment I mentioned the man from the shelter, and what he had claimed, I saw a change in her expression that was subtle, but unmistakable, like a controlled reaction that had been practiced too many times before. She immediately repeated the same version of events I had heard my entire life, describing my father as unstable, unreliable, and someone who had disappeared from responsibility. But this time I was not hearing it the same way anymore, because every sentence she said now had a shadow behind it, as if there were gaps in the story that were carefully avoided rather than naturally forgotten. And the more she spoke, the more I started noticing the structure behind her words, because it was not just a memory she was sharing, it felt like a maintained narrative, something repeated over years until it became stable enough to sound like truth, even if certain parts of it no longer matched what I had seen and heard myself. The real shift happened when I spoke to Daniel, because unlike my mother, he did not rely on emotional storytelling but instead gave controlled, structured answers that avoided direct engagement with the core questions I was asking, especially when I brought up legal restrictions, custody changes, and financial context that my father had described in detail. He did not deny everything outright, but he also never fully addressed anything directly, and that absence of clarity started to feel more meaningful than the words themselves, because it created a pattern where every important question was carefully redirected, softened, or reframed into something less concrete. And in that moment, I realized something I had not fully accepted before, which is that truth in this situation was not missing, it was filtered, shaped, and distributed differently depending on who was speaking, and that meant my entire understanding of my childhood had not been built on one stable story, but on fragments controlled by different people with different motivations. By the time I left that conversation, I no longer felt like I was searching for a single answer, because it became clear that there would not be one clean explanation that ties everything together, and instead I was now standing in the middle of conflicting realities that all contained pieces of truth, but none of them could fully exist without contradiction. And that realization was what finally pushed me out of uncertainty and into action, because once you understand that your past has been shaped through selective truth, you can no longer stay passive in it, even if you are not yet ready to fully understand what the complete picture actually looks like. After those conversations, I stopped thinking that the situation would somehow resolve itself on its own, because it became clear that simply knowing fragments of the truth was not enough if I continued to stay passive, and at some point I had to decide whether I was going to remain inside a story built by other people or start actively engaging with the version of reality I was only now beginning to understand. So I went back to the shelter again, not with questions this time, but with a decision, and when I saw my father sitting there, I realized that he was not expecting anything from me anymore, not hope, not confirmation, not emotional resolution, because people who have been removed from systems for too long eventually stop expecting restoration, and instead learn to survive inside whatever remains available to them. When I told him that I wanted to help him, Not symbolically, but practically, there was a long pause before he responded, not because he didn't understand what I was saying, but because he was trying to process whether this was temporary emotion or something that could actually continue beyond a single moment, and that hesitation alone showed me how long he had been conditioned not to rely on consistency from others. We started with the most basic things, not emotional reconciliation or rewriting the past, but practical stability, documents, housing support, structure that could give him a foundation again, because without that nothing else would be possible. And even though it felt small compared to everything I had learned, I started to understand that rebuilding a life does not begin with answers, but with conditions that allow someone to exist without constant collapse. As we worked through those steps, I noticed something I did not expect, which was that helping him was not only changing his situation, but also changing the way I saw him, because the more I interacted with him in the present instead of only through the lens of the past, the harder it became to hold on to a single fixed version of who he was supposed to be in my memory. There were still moments of emotional distance between us, moments where neither of us knew exactly how to behave in a relationship that had been interrupted for so long, but over time those moments became less intense, not because everything was resolved, but because consistency started replacing uncertainty in small, repeated ways that slowly built something new between us. And at the same time, I began to understand something important about myself, which was that I was no longer just trying to uncover what had happened, but also learning how to live inside the consequences of knowing it, because truth does not only change what you think about the past, it also changes what you feel responsible for in the present. Ethan stayed present through all of this, not trying to control the direction of my decisions, but simply remaining random while everything was still unstable, and that kind of steady presence became something I relied on more than I expected, because in a situation where every relationship carried emotional complexity, stability itself became a rare form of support. And slowly, without any dramatic moment marking it, I realized that the situation had shifted again, because I was no longer only reacting to the past or searching for explanations, I was actively participating in rebuilding something that had been broken long before I ever understood it fully. Months passed after that point, and nothing about the situation ever turned into a perfect resolution, because real life does not organize itself into clean endings the way stories do, and instead what I experienced was a slow, uneven transition into a new version of reality, where the past was no longer something I was trying to solve, but something I had to learn how to live alongside, without letting it completely define my present. My father's life did not suddenly transform into something easy or stable in a dramatic way, but there was progress in the most practical sense, because he had a place to stay, basic structure in his daily life, and the beginnings of a routine that made him feel less like someone erased from the system, and more like someone slowly being reintroduced into it, even if the process was far from complete and still carried many limitations. What surprised me most during this time was not any single revelation, but the emotional adjustment that came with seeing him regularly in the present, because even though I had accepted the truth on an intellectual level, emotionally I was still learning how to integrate two completely different versions of him, the one I grew up with through absence, and the one I was now getting to know through presence. There were moments when everything felt almost normal between us, simple conversations, quiet routines, small shared details that did not feel dramatic but carried more weight than they should have, because they were built on top of years of separation that neither of us could undo, no matter how much stability we were now trying to build. My relationship with my mother became quieter, not fully broken, but no longer built on unquestioned certainty, because even without open confrontation, something had permanently changed between us, and I could no longer fully hear her version of the past without also hearing the gaps that I now knew existed inside it. Daniel remained distant and controlled in the background of everything, and I eventually stopped expecting clarity from him, because it became clear that his role in the story was not to explain, but to preserve a version of events that did not fully align with what I had discovered, and that silence itself became part of the truth I had to accept. Ethan stayed consistent through all of it, and over time I realized how rare that actually was in a situation where every relationship around me carried emotional weight, conflict, or history that complicated communication, because his presence was not defined by trying to fix anything, but simply by staying random while everything was still unstable. One day, my father told me something quietly that stayed with me more than anything else he had said before, that he no longer expected the past to be repaired or rewritten, but that having even a small part of my life in the present was something he never believed he would experience again, and hearing that made me understand that not every ending comes with closure, because sometimes what you gain is not resolution, but time that you were told you would never have again. And in the end, I realized that the truth I had uncovered was not something that gave me a simple answer about my life, but something that permanently changed the way I moved through it, because once you see how fragile and constructed memory can be, you cannot fully return to the version of reality where everything felt simple and unquestioned. So this story did not end with forgiveness or complete understanding, and it did not need to, because what it left me with instead was something more realistic, the ability to continue living forward while carrying a past that finally became visible in its full complexity, even if it never became easy to accept in a single emotional moment.